this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Riprap's academic book television program. My guest today is Anna Clark, and we're talking about her book, The Poison, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy. And like I said before, I'm going to need your help to go through this. Thank you for agreeing to discuss your book. My first question is, how did you get involved?
Sure, how did I get involved? Well, I'm a journalist. I'm a full-time freelance journalist that has been writing from Detroit for a long time, mostly for national publications. And I write about a lot of things, but I've especially been interested in the questions about cities, how they're made and unmade, how policies affect people on the ground, what are the ways through some of the hardest problems we're dealing with as both individuals and communities. And when the Flint water crisis was escalating, I did a few different articles about it, from one, focusing on one particular issue or another, but it became pretty clear quite quickly that this was a story that deserved a much longer look. And so when the opportunity came up to put it together in a book, I was very glad for it.
I know she had quite a community helping you.
Yeah, well, it's an amazing community, right? Like, Flint's just a wonderful place. And I am grateful for how many different people took the time to share stories, either with me directly or, through by giving me the opportunity to kind of sit in some of their own, internal conversations. I wanted to learn as much as I could. I did have some key questions and ideas that were on my mind as I was beginning this book, but I also wanted to have an open enough mind that I was, not just filling in the blanks of what I thought I knew. I wanted to learn from this community that had, been thinking and talking about what was going on a lot longer than I've been here writing about it.
But in producing the book, you had your readers and your researchers, and that's what I'm saying.
Right. Oh, well, yeah. Let's see. So I reported the book, and I also hired someone to do fact checking for me because I wanted to make sure that if nothing else, this book is true. This is the Flint water crisis has had so much misinformation and contradictory information, even if well-meaning, just errors that continually get repeated or myths. I wanted to, make sure it's true. So I did, save up some of my own money to hire someone to check me, and make sure it was accurate. And I also, there was a recent graduate from the University of Michigan who I was able to work with for a little while to do some of the research, to dig up a lot of the archival research, because I wanted to make sure that that this I brought a historical perspective to this water crisis, and she was really wonderful in helping me bring that up.
And you brought information from the Civil Rights Commission?
Right, yeah.
So there was a lot, and then you had people reading chapters and rereading chapters.
A lot of that is just my friends and family, but like people who are close or far away with the story. I wanted to kind of sort of user test it, really, so as I was working on drafts, to just have people read it through, some who were essentially starting from square one with their understanding about what was happening, and others who were very much involved, and just to get some feedback about how this, about how clear I was being, about what unanswered questions, they had, and then I could take that information and make it better, revise it better. And also just, it was nice to have some readers, early on, because it just gave me some encouragement, because this was a really intense, big story. I really wanted to do my best, and, there were some days that were just a real slog, and just knowing that there was a few folks out there who I could talk about it with, really helped.
Well, it seems like the Flint situation's an ecosystem. And it's just, there's all these parts, the self-interest, non-self-interest, it was just a mess.
It was just a mess. I mean, true. It's true.
And it's hard to sort through it. I thought she did a good job on that part. And I was fascinated with the opening quotation from Toni Morrison's book, The Sight of Memory. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was.
Yes. Isn't that amazing? It strikes me in the heart too. And that's I knew that. Can I tell you the honest truth about how that came to be connected with this book? My background is actually in fiction writing. I got an MFA degree in fiction writing. I studied creative writing. I thought I was going to be like a short story writer. I love stories. I love novels. I love literature. And I came across that essay of hers while I was in that program. And I wrote a short story that kind of used that as an epigraph and kind of was a reference in the title. And, I love that story very much, but it's not that great of a short story, and no, it'll never see the light of day, I'm sure. But years later, when I was thinking about this Flint book, this was just in the point where I was working on the book proposal, and it hit me like lightning that, this reference didn't belong with that, bad short story I wrote, 15 years ago. It belongs here. It belongs with this book, and it's both the epigraph and one of the sections in the book is named after that. And I think it's a powerful quote because it gets at the idea of how much we have to learn from our own waterways, how much they teach us how we're connected despite ourselves, how much we are embedded in the natural world. It evokes the power of memory, which I think is so important in understanding what happened in Flint, both the memory of what happened here decades ago, how the memory of what is happening now is going to affect the generations to come. Much of what is true, much of the factual way that this story has unfolded is connected to memory, people's experience of what happened to them and to their community. And I think it just seemed like the perfect fit.
What's the moment you said, I have to do this book?
Oh gosh. It was honestly a little bit more gradual. I knew this was an urgent story and I was writing about it, but with a little bit of guilt because I felt like a lot of people I should have been here sooner, right? As a journalist who was not that far away, who wrote about a lot of these stories. And I remember some of the local media, covering this, It wasn't like I was totally clueless that the water switch had gone wrong, But I was, writing stories that were about Detroit's bankruptcy and other things that were going on at the time. And I didn't start working on my first story explicitly about the water crisis until the fall of 2015. And even then I felt like it was just way too late. But yeah, I did some of these stories, and as I kept learning about what was going on and catching up with where the community had been for a long time, it was just so apparent that just summarizing it wasn't going to work, and it was in fact confusing people more when they were getting the information in just single dispatches, especially when it started exploding in the national consciousness. And what happened was that an agent reached out and asked if I would be interested in doing this as a book. And I was at first pretty cautious because I didn't want to do a kind of, if what she was interested in was a sort of quick rip from the headlines summation, I didn't want anything to do with it. I didn't want to exploit this tragedy to just rush out some kind of thing, and it was so big at the time that I was a little suspicious. But it turned out that she and the publisher I ended up working with were interested in the truth, and interested in doing something that was much more developed and deeper and looked at what made this city vulnerable in the first place, these bigger questions that shaped what happened in Flint and also in communities all over the country that have similar vulnerabilities. And I wanted to explore that. It seemed to tie together a lot of the threads of things I'd been interested in for years, just as a person, just as a citizen in the different kinds of communities I've lived in, and also as a writer, just how do we, what do you do? what do you do with the baggage of the past? You know, what is the best way forward when you inherit, you know, an emergency like this where there's so many intersecting problems. It's not just a technical solution that we need here. You know, we need to start thinking about questions about the democratic process and environmental justice and the human rights. I mean, it's much deeper than just a quick fix up with the pipes and the water treatment. It goes much deeper, and I wanted to explore that, and luckily they did too. So when I realized that was so, I'd be a fool to not step forward.
I was pretty impressed with your research because that enhanced the telling of the narrative as far as what was going on, which is not easy to untangle.
It's not. It's not. But it was great. But it's so important. That's what made me eager, right? You know, because even when I was doing these articles, I was trying to imbue them with as much research as I could. But you can only do so much in a shorter, you know, word count and with less time. And this gave me the opportunity to, you know, spend a few years looking at this and, you know, look back at, you know, some pretty deep history in both the community and with a lot of how water systems were even made and what is, you know, like the Great Lakes themselves, to get an understanding of this like wider ecological context that we're talking about here. It was exciting to me, and if anything, my editor had to keep, you know, she's like, okay, we got to get back, you know, we got to get back to the present day, you know. It was, but there's so much I wanted to reflect forward in here, and and it also was humbling too, because of course I can't, you know, bring forth everything. This is why we need many books about what happened in Flint.
Well, there were several different threads. One of them was racism and how the community has been set up and exploited.
Yes.
You know, and there's some pretty deep things comments you made about that, which is accurate. You know.
Yes, I mean that's one of the things that got talked a lot about, but was, you know, with the Flint water crisis, is it's you know, as a community that's like majority African American and disproportionately poor, about 40% poor, still one of the poorest communities in the nation according to most recent census numbers. It's hard for people to feel like that is just a coincidence that this is where the citywide drinking water disaster happened, and more pointedly, why when things were going wrong, they weren't heard. Why even though they were doing everything they could think of to make themselves visible and to get their concerns and questions acknowledged by a number of different officials and institutions, why they were dismissed and even belittled. And that pattern seems pretty stark, but it seemed worth, you know, kind of going back into and looking at some of these like deeper questions. So when you think about the history of infrastructure and equality, you can't look away from the history of segregation. You know, I mean, that was very explicit. It's like, here are the communities that are going to be on the bottom line worth more. They have access to mortgages, they have access to federal insurance programs. These are the you know, they have more people that they can sell their homes to, you know, just by sheer number. You know, it's like there's some communities were invested in and some communities were disinvested in, specifically because of race and ethnicity. That was very, very clear. And it is, of course, a hard-fought triumph that no longer is by law legal to do that explicitly, but the system we built up is still playing out its same patterns, which we can see if we just look around us. You know, like we can see that we still live in segregated communities by and large. And we can see that the communities where there are where there's a larger presence of people of color, those are the communities that just coincidentally, so-called, have less access to less quality infrastructure and public services, just as there were decades ago. And so what I wanted to do was kind of name that and highlight that, both the national pattern and specifically how it played out in Flint, because I think we need to acknowledge the roots if we're really going to find a solution here.
Well, and the thing of asserting and opposing the system was a profound issue here, because at first these people have been so downtrodden that it was hard for them to say no. This is not right.
I mean, yeah, people had, I guess to be fair, like different experiences, but I think one of the tragedies of this is that there's so many different kinds of urgent issues that this community was dealing with, like urgent life and death issues, like public safety and schools and other public services besides water, that I think when the water crisis came up for a lot of folks, including people at the state, it was one way they could dismiss it or not recognize its urgency was to just say, oh, it's just one more problem on top of every other problem. It just, the city's just a basket case, and that's deeply troubling, and how that normalization of this state of emergency, and I'm separating that phrase out a little bit from the emergency management process, which also, of course, had a really big impact on the city, the decisions that were made with its water. But at the same time, there were people who, just from the very beginning were piping up. I mean, you can just look back. There's like records, like within weeks of the water switch, there's records of emails and phone calls that folks were making to the local, state, and even the EPA, just saying like something seems weird here. It tastes strange. It looks strange. Like something's a little off. Nobody really knew what was going on then or how serious it was, but they weren't being totally passive either. They were engaged, and that became even more so as time went on.
And people at all levels.
Yes.
From ordinary citizens to agency heads and everything. People are saying, wait a minute, brown water.
I mean, that's so disturbing, right? It's so disturbing. Like, you can't look at that and not, feel, how can you tell somebody that that's fine and not a red flag? But people did, and people, some residents were saying that when they would bring samples of their brown water to folks, people thought they were faking it, that they were just like dyeing the water, just, I don't know, for fun. It was so strange, and that was so, even though there was other institutions that were, like General Motors leaving Flint's water system, there were other clear red flags, like the residents weren't just, coming out of, speaking in a vacuum. There was these boil water advisories, there was the violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act with TTHMs, the presence of this carcinogenic byproduct. There were other, and despite all these like escalating water concerns, a lot of officials still felt that they could dismiss what the residents were saying about the quality of the water in their own homes, which seems really strange to me. And
it wasn't just a disadvantage, it was a permanent effect on the residents who were drinking the water.
Yes. The lead poisoning, of course, that getting elevated levels of lead through the drinking water on top of, being more likely to also be exposed to lead from a number of other sources, makes this entire generation of a city's children have like just a serious disadvantage, and the way lead works, we don't totally know what all the impacts are going to be. It'll be we have to wait for them to grow up, frankly. Some people will probably not be very much affected at all. Some people will. It gets in your bones and your tissues. It stays there. Its consequences are erratic. Yeah, in your brain, and it affects, the development. There's impulse control, social skills, or learning abilities. And you can't just fix that.
Take a pill.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, there's no cure. Is what's said. But that said, there are a lot of really wonderful recovery efforts that folks have been engaged with to make sure that the health and social needs and education needs of these children are that they get the best opportunities they can. And I don't want to play into the narrative that, this generation deserves to be stigmatized, that they don't have bright, beautiful futures ahead of them, because I believe they do, but they did not deserve what happened to them. And it didn't have to happen. This was a man-made crisis too, and people aren't wrong to want accountability for that.
One of the points you make in your book is that lead is throughout our culture.
Yes.
And after I interviewed Dr. Mona and read your book, became aware that this is an ongoing problem around the country.
Yes.
That there is poisoning going on all over the place. In fact, in this state alone, there's dozens of places that have similar poisoning going on. And, we're going to have to deal with this at some point.
We do. There's a phrase that Congressman Dan Kildee, who represents the area, likes to say, which is that, essentially that Flint isn't a singular event. It's a warning. It's a warning to communities all over the country. We built our drinking water infrastructure out of one of the world's best known neurotoxins, and we should not have done that because no amount is safe, especially for children, but also adults. And there's no way to keep lead entirely out of the drinking water unless we get rid of it out of our pipes and plumbing fixtures. There's no way. The corrosion control and other water treatment processes can definitely help and should be done, but there's no way to eliminate it. That's why the federal regulations don't require that, because unless we get rid of the lead pipes and plumbing fixtures, we are going to be drinking lead, and that is bad for us. So we should, what we need is to summon the will and the creativity to tackle this problem, because as you said, there's lead pipes all over the country, in poor communities and wealthier communities, suburbs, rural areas, everywhere. So we don't even have an accurate number really about how many pipes there are nationally, because because a lot of folks haven't kept track. It's hard to find them. It's a complex problem, but it's not one that's unsolvable. There are some communities around the country that have been ahead of the curve in replacing their lead-based infrastructure and not even waiting until there was this huge emergency before they did so. That includes Madison, Wisconsin, and Lansing, Michigan, of all places. And I think they present blueprints for those of us who live in other communities to start getting serious about it, because it should be a priority, because this is our water. and we, and again, without it, we die. So I think we should get serious about making sure that the way we deliver water doesn't cause harm to people, doesn't literally poison them. And aside from that, even in communities that might not have lead-based infrastructure issues with their water systems, our drinking water systems are severely underfunded. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. This is why we hear about main breaks quite frequently, pipes that are even up to like 80 some years old. They even just choosing to invest in them, whatever metal they're made out of, is really important for both conservation purposes, for affordability issues, for so we're not losing so much water through leaks and then putting that burden on the ratepayer to make up for it, and also just because it's the right thing to do, just in terms of planning.
Some of the officials have lost track of where the pipes are.
Right.
What they're made of.
Yeah, this is why it's so hard. Like, it's such a complex problem. It's expensive, it's complicated. You don't have a lot of information to start from. Like, nobody wants to dig up the whole town just guessing where the pipes are. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons, rational reasons, why people have kind of kicked the can on this. It's long term. So any public official who starts the campaign for this may not still be in office by the time it's done. It's a long term thing. But again, I just don't really see what the alternative is. Like, continue drinking water that's tainted with lead? I just don't think that's a good alternative, So, like, it is tricky and challenging, but it is also possible, as other communities are finding out. And Flint, too, that is, in the worst of circumstances, getting its infrastructure replaced, is creating a blueprint that can present information to other communities about how you do this, because it too, of course, did not know where all its lead pipes were when it began this process. in
Well,
terms of planning.
some of the officials have lost track of where the pipes are,
Right.
and what they're made of.
Yeah, this is why it's so hard. Like, it's such a complex problem. It's expensive. Yeah, and it doesn't go away just because we ignore it, right? I mean, I want to, there's wonderful, ingenious consequences of the industrial age, like products that made lives better, jobs that transformed family histories, building a middle class. It's powerful and wonderful, but it also, hinged on sort of sidestepping environmental responsibility in a lot of ways, in a ways that were for most of the industrial age totally legal. We didn't have, for example, any regulations on what could be dumped into rivers and lakes and other waterways until the 1970s. So, at the peak of many of these companies, their success was subsidized by the fact that they could just dump their waste with no consequences whatsoever for them. But there are consequences. And even decades on, we still deal with it. So that includes the lead-based pipes, includes the PFAS that Michigan's dealing right now, which is this like industrial chemical byproduct from both military bases and paper plants and stuff. And that's it doesn't vanish just because we wish it away. It stays there, and unless we're intentional about cleaning it up and keeping it from polluting our land and water in the future, we're going to be struggling.
And we can't use tricks, which is what happened with Flint.
Tricks.
All kinds of tricks.
Right.
Where people who were in the bureaucracy that could have dealt with it denied reports, went slow on other things, pretended it didn't exist and all that, which is a pretty horrible subtopic with this, but it's true. Yeah. And then to make some kind of grandiose thing like the switch in the water without considering what that meant, and having worked it out. And that switch from Detroit water to Flint water was just awful.
It was managed so badly. I don't think there can be any dispute about that, even as much as in contention with this. But yeah, shortcuts aren't good enough. When we're talking about the serious consequences for both public health and for the environment. This is why we need agencies that are 100% committed to the public good, and policies that empower them. And you could, because we can't, there really is nothing else that's more important. I know people sometimes pit economic well-being, jobs, and industry and so on against public health and the environment, but the job zone isn't going to be good enough. That you can't, you need to be alive. You need to know that your children are healthy and well-being. That's where we should start, and then build our economy from that, from people who are thriving, not sacrificed. That's a phrase that's used by one researcher. He talks about communities that have a disproportionate number of polluting plants, where they're consolidated, which tends to be poor and majority people of color neighborhoods, because again, we see this infrastructure inequality play out that way. Those are the communities that are quote unquote worth less on the bottom line, so that's where you put all these plants. And he calls those areas sacrifice zones. Those are the areas that we've decided to sacrifice for the sake of everybody else. And the people in them are the ones we have apparently decided are worth sacrificing to, and it's cold to put it like that, but it is how it is. And if we are uncomfortable with that, we need to change the pattern and start imagining better ways of doing things. I believe in our potential. I think we can do things better. We just but it begins with facing up to the legacies that we've inherited.